Optimal health for high performers. This is the Health Upgrade Podcast with Dr. Nawaz Habib.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Health Upgrade Podcast. This is Dr. Habib. I am here with my co-host, JP. How are you, sir?
Doing very well. Thank you.
And we have a wonderful guest today, Don Moxley, a gentleman I met not too long ago online. And with regards to a webinar that the two of us were supporting a mutual client on, and had a wonderful conversation with him following. I had a chance to come on his podcast, and now we're really excited to have him here to help dig into the world of HRV for high performance and recovery. Thanks for coming, Don.
Listen, I am so honored and excited to be here. You guys, you're two people I pay close attention to, so being here on your podcast is an honor for me. Thank you.
Let's start off talking a little bit about you, your journey, how HRV became this tool that you are utilizing to help with high performance training, high performance optimization, and high performance recovery. I'd love to hear kind of that back end story and how you got into this.
Sure. So let's go way back a little bit to learn a little bit about me. I think it helps is that I'm a kid who grew up on a farm in eastern Ohio, and big farm. We farmed the reclaimed strip mine ground down there, and at one time we had 1,000 head of cattle down there, so it was full on Yellowstone. And it was made very clear to me by my parents that I was going to college. Now, along the way, I also was a wrestler. That we lived in a house that was pretty. It was pretty rough, and in the wintertime, the water in the house froze. It didn't have appropriate insulation, and so if we didn't wrestle in the wintertime, we didn't get a warm shower that day. So wrestling was kind of a necessity. I had an older brother that started into it, and I followed him and became a good wrestler as a senior in high school. And mom and dad said, you're going to college. And at the time, Ohio State is really the only agricultural school in the state of Ohio. So I went up to Ohio State in Columbus, and I walked on the wrestling team. Now, I was the worst guy in the room. Without a doubt, and probably should not have been allowed to be on the team. Practiced about 15 days the first year, hurt a knee, was basically done for that season, came back my sophomore year, and I was a wrestler who cut a lot of weight. I would cut from like 230 to 177, which has all the issues that go with that too. But sophomore, did twice as well that year, practiced 30 days that year, hurt the other knee, and started asking questions like, okay, what's it take to compete? And the answer was, you got to get strong. You got to get stronger. You got to stay healthier. So I dove into strength and conditioning. And when I got strong, I got good. Wound up captaining the team my senior year, won a Big Ten title that year, set the school record for falls my last two seasons. So I went from a very average wrestler to a pretty good wrestler. Never made All-American, never made national champion, but still have records that stand today. So it was a good experience. But what I learned was, gentlemen, is that I turn everything into a math problem. Okay, let's solve for the variable that's limiting. Let's fix that variable, and let's go solve for the next variable. So through whether it was either structural strength and conditioning or psychological understanding, sports science and psychological, these were all elements I had to solve for, which kind of set me on my way in life. Finished up grad school. I left, I figured out that agriculture was a loser's game unless you owned the land, and there was no way. And I had fallen in love with human physiology at that point. So I was full in there. So we advance a few years. I'm working as a professor at a community college in Columbus, and we had this piece of technology in our lab that the heart rate monitor company Polar eventually bought this company. And I would go out and do support for them, teach people how to use this particular piece of equipment. So I'm working for Polar, and at the time I'm teaching my students that you measure heart rate with two fingers on the carotid. And then I'm introduced to this piece of technology called a wireless heart rate monitor, which is life-changing, and integrated technology into what I was doing. But simultaneously, while I was at Polar, they were introducing a group of features in their products called Own Zone, Own Index, Own Recovery that were HRV-based features. And I'd never heard, with a master's degree in exercise physiology, I'd never heard of heart rate variability back then. And I still don't think they're teaching it in ex-phys courses yet. Because one of the things that always bothered me as an exercise physiologist, listen, just setting someone's heart rates and training zones. You usually started at max and worked your way down. And you got max either the 220 minus your age, or you put them on a treadmill until they George Jetsoned off the back, and then you had your numbers and you could work from there. I was never comfortable with that. And then I looked at this stuff that they were doing with HRV, and I'm like, wow, this is really interesting. So instead of starting at the top and working down, I start at the bottom of the zone and work up, which really appealed to me. So I wound up having a little facility in the little town that we lived in. And I had this experience one day. I just routinely started measuring the HRV of everybody who came into my lab, mainly because I don't know who this person is. And Dr. Habib, in practice, this person walks in, you don't know who they are. You don't know what's going on. And I had a police officer come over to do an assessment one day. I think it was a 9:00 appointment. I wire him up, and his HRV, his SDNN's only about 20, 25 milliseconds. And I looked at him and I said, how much did you sleep last night? And he goes, why do you ask? And I said, well, I'm seeing some indications that you're pretty tired. And he says, well, I just got off a shift. He says, I didn't tell you that, but he just finished working midnights. And I said, listen, I can do this test. I said, but the results you're going to get are not going to be effective or accurate. And that was one of the first times when I really, this biomarker, this key performance indicator really gave me a way to impact this person that's sitting in front of me, to get a picture into them. So we continue to do work. And then the wrestling coach at Ohio State, the current wrestling coach at Ohio State, calls me. This is January 2015. And he and I had gotten to be friends. My old coach had introduced us. We just got to be friends. And he was training for this event that's in Columbus. It's called Pelotonia. I helped him set his heart rates. I helped him do all this. And he was very successful with it. And he's like, I've never seen anybody do what you do. And all I was doing was straight up basic physiology. It was just basic stuff. But it'll tell you that this guy wrestled, was a 2-time Big Ten champ, 2-time national runner-up at the University of Iowa, wrestled for Dan Gable, the legendary coach Dan Gable. And he had still never been exposed to any of this exercise science. Well, 2015, he calls me. He says, listen, I've got a wrestler that's struggling. He says, I want you to work him up the same way you worked me up. I said, okay, bring him over. And this kid walks in on it was a Sunday morning, 9:00 meeting. He had wrestled a dual meet Friday night. Kid walks in, I wire him up. And when I say wired, we're using wireless technology, but I get the straps on him and so forth. And his SDNN was 10 milliseconds at rest. And so I don't say anything to anybody. I'm like, listen, why don't you go out there and lay down in my little facility there? And he goes down and lays down for 5 minutes. SDNN climbs to 100 milliseconds. And as soon as he stands up, it drops back down to 10. And so at that point, I'm like, okay, I saw what I needed to see right there. But we put him on the erg. He does about half of what he should do. And I looked at the coach and I said, so you have a classic overtraining syndrome going on here. And he goes, how do you know that? And I explained all the autonomic functions to him. And he said, so what? And Ohio State at the time, this is the other interesting part. Ohio State at the time had a wrestler who had won 3 national titles, was coming back to win his 4th. At that time, only 4 people had ever done that. And they had a set of freshman recruits, 3 freshmen that all wound up being 4-time All-Americans, all national champions. One was an Olympic gold medalist in 16. So we've got this convergence of talent in the program, but you can't win a national title with 4 point scores. If you want to win a national title in wrestling, you've got to have 5, 6, 7 point scores. And so the kid I'm working up, his name was Kenny Kortz, is very talented Pennsylvania wrestler, had won 3 state titles in Pennsylvania, which is really hard to do. Very talented kid. And I said to the coach, I said, listen, here's what's going on. This athlete is maladapting to your training. You can't train him like you're training everybody else. You got to train him for what he's ready to do. And at that time, I'd earned the trust of the coach. And the coach says, so what do we do? I said, well, we put a heart rate monitor on him and we put controls in place. And one of the first things I did is I sat down with him and we discussed his sleep environment. Girlfriend was pissed off at me. I'm like, listen, I need you sleeping in a bed by yourself, which I've got some funny stories about that with HRV. So we get him sleeping in a good environment. We modify 9 of his workouts. And so we go into the Big Ten tournament. So to qualify for nationals, you got to place in Big Tens. And Big Ten's the toughest wrestling conference in the country. So 12 of the top 15 teams in the country come out of the Big Ten. But if you place in the top 8 of the tournament, you qualify for the national tournament. So we got him through the Big Tens. Up until the point I started working with him, he was stealing matches like 2-1, 3-2. It was just really tight stuff. During the Big Ten tournament, he had to score 12 points twice in order to win the match to get through. And I was like, we're making progress here. And his pre-practice HRVs had climbed to about 50 milliseconds of RMSSD. So we're slowly climbing up. We get him through Big Tens. We bring him back home. And then in between Big Tens and nationals, I had 2 weeks. And I have a bike ergometer that I could program the workload watt by watt. It's called a Velotron. It's all computer controlled. And I knew exactly where his thresholds were. And literally every time he came over and did a threshold workout, you saw his pre-practice HRV climbing to where we sent him to nationals with a pre. I only got him 2 days before he left. I didn't travel with the team at that time, but I got him up to 70 milliseconds of RMSSD. Kid goes to nationals, placed 5th in the country, makes All-American. Ohio State wins the national title that year. And coaches that 2 weeks before were looking at me like, you're ruining this kid's life because, if you want to be a national champion, you got to train like a gladiator. And I'm like, no, I said, you got to train based on what you're able to do. Well, those same coaches are looking at me like, okay, you got to tell me what this voodoo is you have. And the coach said, I want you on the program. So we moved in and really started the sports science program. Now, I had a teammate. You guys might have heard of him, Dr. Rauf Garbo. He's the director of autonomic medicine down at VMI. We called him Ron. Ron calls me and he says, and he got me what's called a first beat, their bioharness. So now I have a tool that I can do some more extensive HRV studies with these athletes. And we start looking at nighttime resting RMSSDs and we start programming around. And by the way, my Olympic gold medalist, nighttime resting average, 125 milliseconds of RMSSD. My national champion, 98 milliseconds. My guy that was 3rd in the country, 90 milliseconds. So when you graphed the nighttime resting RMSSDs, it literally correlated with placement. This was the first indication that we saw. It's like, okay, this makes a lot of sense. Now, JP, simultaneously, Ohio State football was working with the Air Force Research Lab on wearable technology. And they came to me and said, we see what you're doing. We want to help you. What do you need? And I said, I need devices. And they gave me 16 Omega Wave devices. So I go to where I'm collecting 1 person a day to where I'm collecting 16 people a day. We also developed a heart rate program where I had heart rate monitors on we had heart rate monitors on all of the athletes when they were doing their general conditioning. We had heart rate monitors on 16 of the athletes while they wrestled, so that we got a device so I could put the transmitter. It was in the back of the scapula, but it's still the sensor still wrapped around the chest, so we could wrestle with them. And the last year of the program, I collected 3.5 million data points on a college wrestling team. We qualified 10 guys for nationals. First time we'd ever qualified the entire starting lineup. We had 8 All-Americans, most in school history. But the 2 guys that did not make All-American, I could have told you the first day of the tournament because their nighttime resting, this was morning RMSSDs, were too low. And You know what? I think the data says that if you send a wrestler to nationals, if they qualify and get to nationals and they don't have at least 70 milliseconds of RMSSD, they won't make All-American. Everyone I've sent with 75 or more made All-American. Everyone I've sent with 70 or less didn't. So in 17, when we started to realize this, we started investing in recovery. Dr. Garbo calls it intentional recovery. We have intentional training. We have intentional skill. Let's do intentional recovery. We use sensory deprivation float tanks. We floated that team 140 times that year because it made a difference. We taught recovery breathing. I spent 3 years teaching box breathing, both before practice when they're warming up. We would teach box breathing. Dr. Garbo gave me a clock that we put on the wall that had a sweep second hand so that we could get the guys to realize it. And then after practice, when they'd lay down the cool down, we'd also do a quick 1 to 3 minute session of breathing just to teach the skill. So it was just a really cool experience. And then let me add one more with that group. My gold medalist, Kyle Snyder, and he's given me permission to talk about this, but his senior year, so he's already won an Olympic gold medal in 16. So then 17, so 16 is the national champion, 17 is the national champion. In 2018, the wrestler from the University of Michigan, big kid, he would cut. So in wrestling, heavyweight has a limit now. It's 285 pounds. My guy wrestles 97 kilos internationally, so he walks around our room about 230 pounds. The kid he's wrestling from Michigan cuts to 285, has a 700-pound squat, and is also a world champion. So he's also got skills. Well, we're wrestling the dual meet up in Ann Arbor, and I'm measuring everybody that morning. And Kyle, who I'm used to measuring at 150, 130 milliseconds, that morning was 37. Now, I didn't say anything to him. I measured these guys in the morning. I'm like, yeah, you look great. You're ready to go, because I can't change anything at that point, right? But he lost the first match that he's lost in 3 years. And I go and I dig into the data a little bit, and I have LFHF on that platform. His LFHF ratio was 20. And for the listeners, what that means is he was very sympathetic or hypo-parasympathetic, probably both, and he was both. And so I brought him back down, and I brought him into my office. I said, let me show you what's going on. And he says, so what do we do with it? And I handed him a heart math inner balance. I said, let me have your phone. We loaded the software. We plugged it in. He bit on the gamification of the heart math product, just locked in on it. He's running at the highest challenge level by the end of the day and just poured himself into it. Wrestled this kid 2 more times. Kid's name was Adam Kuhn. Wrestled him in the Big Ten finals, wrestled him in the national finals. We never had a LFHF of greater than 2. So we were able to go from 20 down to 2. I usually like my LFHFs below 1. I like to have that ratio completely flipped. But I took 2. And he wins a Big Ten title, wins the national title. We didn't win another national title that year. Penn State and us were going at it. It was an unbelievable tournament. But yeah, that was, that goes from discovering what is HRV to, okay, let's see if we can figure out, does it make a difference? And we saw it with one kid. We expanded the program, then we kept expanding to where, like I said, it was pretty cool. I had the resources of the Air Force Research Lab for data analytics as well. I also had the resources of the Fisher College of Business at Ohio State. Their big data group helped me do data management. We built an athlete management system using Google Sheets, because I didn't have a budget for, an AMS. We did it using Google Sheets. I had 6 Google Sheets that we were pounding 3.5 million data points into that we had dashboarded up. And it wound up being just a really cool experience. And since then, my daughter, who has now graduated from Ohio State back in 2020 with a degree in exercise science, much to her father's dismay. Then went on to Northwestern, working with the Northwestern lacrosse program, which is a perennial powerhouse program. And they had put a first beat system in with the Northwestern program. And Jacqueline calls me one day and she says, Dad, she says, I can see it in the lacrosse team, the same thing you saw in the wrestlers. I know when they're going to play well. I know when they're going to blow someone out, and I know when it's going to be a challenge. So she saw it there. And, we're moving into an interesting time that the information's out there and it makes sense, but I'm not sure the dogma that's running organized college sports is ready for this.
So how do we expand this from sports where it's clearly being used successfully? You're using it successfully, your daughter's using it successfully, and I guarantee you, aware of it, that there are plenty of professional teams
Absolutely.
in both football and basketball, et cetera, that are very aware of this and are using it. But how do we translate this into, for example, high volume trading on the stock market, or top law firms that are looking to win major cases, getting out in front of the Supreme Court and arguing a case? Well,
or entrepreneurial
you don't want to have your heart rate
success.
variability. You don't want to have your heart rate variability tanking the day before or the day
And you can
of.
only imagine that it does. As they're
Of course.
preparing for that event, they lose sleep. There's all the stress. You know that it's tanking.
Their sympathetic nervous system is clearly becoming activated.
Yes.
How do we bring this same, which is great for athletic performance, but how do we take this into law enforcement? Where you want to make certain that when you put your policeman on the beat, in a rough neighborhood, that his heart rate variability is high enough that he's going to be making better decisions, because we know that you make better decisions when you are not in a sympathetically overactive state, where you've got parasympathetic activity that's allowing you to think more broadly, allowing you to make decisions sort of almost separated from yourself. You're making decisions that are just the right decisions as opposed to guided by threat response. So how do we take this great knowledge and this great, development of understanding and bring it into these other areas? Because I get the athletics they get it, because the trainers
Not all of them.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, we are still very much early stage on this. So I want to answer that in two parts. I'm going to take the second half first. JP, one of the reasons I'm not at Ohio State, I thought that was my last job. Okay. I'm back at my alma mater. We're doing good work. It makes sense. But one of the things that happened the last 2 years we were there was the coaching staff came to me and said, hey, we've got a problem that we have to solve. We have 3 strength coaches. One's university supplied. One came from the Olympic training system that we had there. And my Olympic gold medalist, Kyle, had his own guy who was working with a couple more people on the team. And they said to me, which one should we pick? And I said, don't pick. I said, let the guys pick. And they're like, what are you talking about? Isn't something better? And okay, I'm going to say something right now that's blasphemy in that field, is that it all works. Okay. In strength and condition, it all works. Everything works. Okay. But people build reputations on their program. Okay. And this is how they earn huge salaries, and they have these unbelievable jobs. And frankly, the difference in programs and trying to dissect the difference in programs, frankly, is bullshit. It's pure bullshit. It all works. And you know what? I go back to that last year in 18, had 10 guys on the team working with 3 strength coaches. It broke down 3-3-4. As even as you can break 10 into 3, it broke with those 3. We had 8 All-Americans. It broke 2-2-3. And I'm like, yes, you have to lift, you have to condition. Now, I think there's a lot better science that goes into cardiovascular conditioning, the things that we can do. I think we can be very good, particularly with what we know about zone 2, zone 3 work, the value of those positions, what we're understanding about cortisol and your ability. Listen, cortisol management is critical. I mean, it's just absolutely critical. So, but JP, going back to your question, I think we do it with conversations like this. And I think that high-powered traders, we already have data from law enforcement that shows the better the HRV, the less civilians you shoot, okay, in testing. Okay, that we know this, not just in police, but we also see this in special operators in the military. We know this is the case. And I think the culture of recovery is working its way into those very high-end performing groups. You know, I have a cousin that lives out in Connecticut. He's a Manhattan executive guy. And there was a bunch of people at a party. And one of the people at the party was the president of the YPO, the Young Professionals Organization in Manhattan. So you can imagine that organization, right? There's awareness. Okay. Oh, they might have an Aura ring, or they might have this, but there's so much pressure. There's so much pressure from the existing practices. Listen, it took the coach at Ohio State. He took a lot of heat when he said, this wrestler is working with Don. Okay. And there were 4 other coaches in that room that are like, this is going to be an absolute failure. There was a lot of pressure on him to enforce that decision, and it paid off. Okay. So
like the scene from Moneyball, right? Where they're all talking about, what the baseball player's girlfriend looks like. And that's as if that has something to do with, how well he's going to play.
And there's still so much of that in society. And now we balance this because I don't think academics does a good job of addressing that. So much of academics is, what do I need to do to get my study done, to publish my paper, to get it reviewed so that I can get my PhD and go teach somewhere? I realize that was an incredibly minimalist statement, but there's a lot of truth in it. And, I just sent a good friend of mine, in the Journal of Strength and Conditioning, they just did a review article on how bodybuilders get big. And I'm like, are you effing kidding me? This is the shit we were talking about 40 years ago. And I went to the NSCA meeting 2 years ago, and it's the same stuff. They're talking about the same issues. Now there's some changes with some measurement, like force plates are starting to get a little bit more popular. But personally, with what I understand at this point, if I had the opportunity to go into a school or go into a situation, I would completely redesign the entire training facility. The entire training facility is about sympathetic load, period, end of story. Okay. Well, what we know is you can only go so far with that. And the other problem is with academics. I call myself an applied scientist because here's my challenge. Someone can walk into my lab, into my facility, and they might be 3rd standard deviation to the right or a 3rd standard deviation to the left of this particular piece. I can't just say, oh, this is what the mean does and this is what the standard deviation is. I've got to pay attention to the entire spectrum and recognize when someone is an outlier one way or the other. And there are so many of them. There are so many of these outliers in these particular areas. So you can't just read, the latest peer-reviewed article. You can read it for the logic, for the science, for the physiology, for these things. But when it says, high intensity training is better than some other kind of training, well, maybe for that person in the middle, but I've got
at that time.
Yeah. So
that's the message,
So this is the challenge, I think, JP, the answer to your question. How do we get this into that culture? We've got to get better at applying the science. Okay. We have to think. Now we've got new systems developed. We've got the ability to observe HRV over a long period of time. One of the problems with HRV right now is that people wake up in the morning, they look at a number and they make a decision, which is a huge mistake. It's an absolute huge mistake. You should be looking at 7 to 14 day averages. But more importantly, you should have a goal on the horizon. You should have a program to achieve the goal. The data sets that we get back are just telling you, are you aligning with the direction of the map that you've sent, or do you need to change your course? that's where the value of the data sets come into play, and the measurement on a daily basis comes into play. And, on my podcast, we've done several episodes on this about the toxicity of too much data to the non-data person. This is it. And honestly, I want to ask you guys a question about this, because one of the things that I've run into, I've spent the last 5 years working in nutritional supplement space, longevity-based nutritional supplement space. And we actually developed a product that's called HRV Plus. You can find it at modemethod.com, but it's a cannabis extract and SPM combination. And you know what? It works really well. And so we've been working in that space, but if I've talked to one high performance doctor, I've talked to a dozen of them that have really bad HRVs, RMSSDs, less than 20 milliseconds. So many times people buy this device and they put it on for simple confirmation bias. This ring isn't telling me I'm doing great, so I'm going to stop wearing it. And I talk to people about this and I say, listen, there's a range on this, is that when you die, you're at 0. And if you're an Olympian, you're in the 150s. Work your way towards the Olympian, not towards the dead person. Work your way away from 0. Why do you think so many well-functioning medical professionals who phenotypically look fabulous, they just look fabulous, but they've got RMSSDs that suck? Why do you think that is?
I see this all the time. Every time I'm at a conference, and I'll have 3, 4, 5 docs come up to me and they're like, so my HRV is 12 and what do I need to do about this? And I hear this all the time. This is such a common issue. And it comes down to the fact that people are stressed. Like doctors, the medical system, people, they're incredibly stressed and they don't know how to initiate that recovery process. What I've found, and Don, this links very much to what you're talking about, is your lab, your gym, in an optimal scenario, is not a full sympathetically driven gym, but a lot of their offices are, right? Every room that they walk into, there's a new patient with a new issue that needs to be handled in a particular way. There's a new stressor, and they're running around and they're not taking time for themselves to recover between patients, because systemically it's an issue, particularly something that I'm aware of here in Canada, where the system is incredibly taxing on the doctor themselves. But when it comes to these healthcare practitioners that are under major stressors, they haven't learned to do that recovery process. They haven't added in that parasympathetic healing capacity into their day-to-day practices. JP, you had something you wanted to...
I think that's absolutely correct, but I think there's 3 other really simple things that are affecting physicians. And I've been surrounded by physicians, for my entire life. Grew up around them with my parents. And alcohol. They drink, okay? And they drink fine wine. But fine wine and Ripple have the same amount of alcohol. And it's the same damaging effects. So that's 1. 2, sleep. They are getting terrible sleep. And the reason they're getting terrible sleep is because they train themselves that way. That's what the medical training is all about, is basically how do you function? How do you still perform despite being exhausted? Because they're training, if you will, for the worst case disaster scenario. Okay. But that is not a healthy way of being. And the third is really the fact that they are perfectionists by their nature. And as a result, they either are overtraining, okay, or they don't train at all, okay? They don't know the happy medium. There's no Goldilocks range that they exist comfortably, okay? They're either all super Ironman triathletes who are way overtrained and are disasters on that end of the spectrum, or they're, Dr. Heal Thyself, and they're overweight, they're eating all the wrong foods and not taking care of themselves. And as a result, you don't have anybody who's in that mindset, in that training, in that field, who is really just looking to be as healthy as they can be. They think they are, but they're not.
All of these link to these practices and habits that are maladaptive. They were implemented in a habitual routine situation during their training. And a lot of it has to do with these performance-based things, right? I need to achieve this. So doing these particular things, overstressing myself and not sleeping and learning to function well on low levels of sleep. So they've become adapted to that, but it's a maladaptation when it comes to overall physiology. And that's where they're seeing these HRVs that are tanked completely. Alcohol, maladaptation tool, right? It's a coping mechanism to keep you in a dopaminergic kind of, things are working well. And JP, the last thing you mentioned there, the food, the not eating well, those are dopamine seeking areas. And it comes, a lot of it comes down to that seeking that dopamine response, right? How do I experience this pleasure or this joy of the life that I'm living, that I'm experiencing? And they have yet to figure out that these positive recovery-based parasympathetic driving practices is actually where the magic lies. It's actually what's going to help support that HRV marker. So you're absolutely right with those three, but they're all driving that dopaminergic desire.
I tell them when I'm having a long conversation with them, I say, listen, going from 50 to 30 is pretty easy to do. A good training load, or a bad night's sleep or something like that. Going from 12 to 5 is really hard to do. You've really got to ratchet the bad shit up. So
alcohol will do that. Alcohol can do it.
Isn't that funny? Is that, and I'm sure you hear it. Everyone that I know that gets an Oura Ring or gets a device, they're like, man, this has really affected my drinking. And then I follow up. I said, well, I started working in the cannabis industry down in Florida back in 2019. I stopped drinking. If I want to modify my self chemically, and I do it with cannabis, I feel like $1 million the next day, and my HRV has responded very well. You guys will find this really interesting, I think. When I went into that business down there, I was hired to build a medical brand. Cannabis, we legalize it on the back of epileptics and cancer patients. And then it immediately becomes an adult use rec market right off the bat. And they'd hired me to go down and build a medical market on this. So I have very little deep understanding of the endocannabinoid system at this time. And so I do my classic, rabbit hole dive, read everything I can. But I come across this paper on fear conditioning and its role of anandamide in the amygdala. So for the audience, anandamide is what's called an endocannabinoid that your body makes when you move. Primarily, it's the product of movement. And the amygdala is the part of your brain that senses fear and says, hey, you probably, you need to get out of here or you're safe. Well, in fear conditioning in dogs and mice, what they found is that when you fear condition these animals, the level of anandamide drops in the amygdala permanently. It doesn't go up and down. It drops. And when you look at this, and in my family, we've had to do some work with trauma and trauma rehabilitation and so forth. This is the effect of trauma, is that, and with enough trauma, you're going to see the drop of anandamide, which is going to lead to the hypervigilance, which is going to lead to the hypersympathetic state. And no wonder all these Vietnam vets came home smoking pot. Because we took a bunch of kids from Canada and the United States and we dropped them in Vietnam, which is, I tell people, if you're born in a rattlesnake pit, the only way you survive is through hypervigilance. It's the only way. Even if I take you out of the rattlesnake pit and put you in a house full of bunny rabbits, you're still hypervigilant. But people don't like to be in that state. It just wears you out. No wonder cannabis consumption is so high. Well, what we're finding, and this is what we put into the HRV plus, it's not the THC, it's not the mind altering part of the cannabis that makes the difference. There's a bunch of other molecules in there, and this is one of the things that we were working with Mode and Method, is how can we take terpenes, how can we take some of these cannabinoids and use them specifically to modify state to do these, but do so in a way that's not going to lead to shitty alcohol metabolism in your liver. So yeah, this was, and And, by the way, I didn't know this. I taught exercise physiology for 27 years. The runner's high is not dopamine. It's anandamide. That's where it's coming from. And so when we start to look at these things, and there's still a lot of people that have a problem with cannabis and their ability to use, just mention the word. We're actually doing some work on a project that we're probably going to be working with the extracts, but we're not even going to mention the word because there's just so much, bullshit that goes with it. But and it ties right to vagal nerve tone, vagal nerve performance, especially upstream. Once you go, when you get up into the amygdala and you're working your way down through there, even into the hippocampus and prefrontal cortex. One of my thesis is that one of the challenges that we have today is we live in environments where our environment is creating the stress. And the environment can be, we live in a house that's temperature controlled 12 months a year. You never go outside a range of 70 to 75 degrees. Whereas we evolved to go from hot to cold there's a benefit from that. We live in a house that we don't have to climb stairs. Or it's completely flat. We don't have to adjust to terrain. Well, so many times I have people come into my facility that are having back problems. And they take their thumb and they put it right there on the top of the glute, right where the sciatic nerve works its way out of the lower vertebrae. And I'm like, well, yeah, your iliopsoas isn't being stimulated, and it's arguing with you. And the iliopsoas crosses the sciatic nerve 2 times. So if it starts spasming, you're going to have, radiating pain. You're going to have back pain. So we do this simple little exercise where you just stimulate. You pull your knees to your chest. We get on a ball and pull our knees. We call it one of my aspirin exercises. So our challenge is that we live in environments, bad movement. We live in environments where we don't have to move. And so we can hack that with exercise. And there's great ways to do this. We live in an environment where we have so much access to shitty nutrient food-like substances. I think Michael Pollan called it. And you can hack that with supplementation. But even our food that we buy in the grocery store, I just spent 5 years working for a company called Longevity Labs that have a product called Spermidine Life. Spermidine is this little molecule that's in your cells that methylates your autophagy genes. So even if you fast, if you don't have spermidine on board, you don't get autophagy. Well, what we found is they extract this product from Austrian and southern Germany, northern Italy wheat. We couldn't find spermidine-rich wheat germ in this country. So our industrial farming processes have lowered the nutrient values and the micro and the phytonutrient levels to the point to where it's starting to affect us. Because autophagy is critical. And when you look at the pandemic and all the things going on, COVID affected the autophagy process. It absolutely directly affected it. So our food is a challenge. The micronutrients, the phytonutrients are critical. We live in environments where sleep is de-emphasized, or it has been de-emphasized for a long time. I think we're finally starting to see it come across. But we still have TVs in every bedroom. We still have disruptors.
iPhones in our hands right to the point where we go to bed.
Yeah. And we have all these disruptors to sleep, to our circadian cycle. And then the fourth, I call this the rocks in my jar, my jar of health and longevity and performance. So it's movement, nutrient-dense food, quality sleep, and light. So light has both. There's toxic light and there's nutritive light. So recognizing, now listen, we're sitting here talking, JP, you're in Arizona, Navaz, you're in Toronto, I'm in Northern Indiana. We're getting flooded with toxic light. My computer monitor, the lights around me. So you got to pay attention to that. There's a benefit that comes from it, but there's also a cost. You got to manage that. So you'll notice over my shoulder, my red light panel, my near infrared red light panel. And then you'll look over this shoulder, that's my sauna. And I live in an RV. I live in a 40-foot recreational vehicle that my wife and I moved into 3 years ago. And I didn't make the decision to do this until I figured out how to put that in. When I figured out how to put a sauna in with all the rest of my exercise stuff, that's when we made the decision to do what we're doing. But those are the rocks in the jar: movement, nutrient dense food, sleep, light, but it goes into the jar of purpose, that the environment is pushing back on us hard. And you have to wake up in the morning and have a purpose that causes you to say, I've got to get my movement in. I have to pay attention to my food. I have to go ahead and take care of my sleep. And I need to affect my light because, I like to say we live in 3/3 of our life. We spend the first third of our life learning. We spend the second third of our life earning, serving others, whether it's work or our family. But then the third third is your third. My daughter finished up her work at Ohio State and got her first job and moved out 3 years ago on January 2nd. That day, my wife and I entered our third third. It's our third. This is one of the great things about living in an RV. A little over a year ago, we finished a year where I was in 10 national parks in 1 year. That was so cool. And so we're learning to use this time, but I can still, as long as I've got my internet, I've got a Starlink. So we're sitting up in Yosemite 2 years ago. We got 50 inches of snow in 4 days, but I'm still working. I've still got my sauna. I've still got my exercise equipment. I've still got all the tools that I need. But this is that challenge. So whether you're an elite athlete who's putting together the parts for, or you're a trader, or a high lawyer, high cognitive athlete, I think we can say, or an athlete, whether you're a firefighter, police officer, operator, or soldier, these are all tools. We're all humans. The human body functions a certain way. What we see from our elite performers are glimpses. We see glimpses of, okay, how does this work? That can then carry down to the elite performers. I like to say their mothers and their grandmothers. It's not just the gold medalist, but it's the gold medalist's mom trying to reach her goals in her second third in life, or the gold medalist grandmother who's trying to get the most out of her third. We see it, and it all applies. You guys see this in your work as well.
I think you're really hitting an important point here. And the fact that a few of my takeaways from everything that we've discussed so far, there is no such thing as a one size fits all, right? Every single person has their own individual practices, individual training capacity, individual recovery capacity that's required. And you kind of have to find that for yourself. And that's where I think wearable technology can help to guide that process a little bit, to understand what are the things that are knocking you down and what are the things that are building you up. But it's on each individual to help discover what that middle point is of how far you can push yourself and how much you need to be able to recover. That second thing is this cyclic nature. You mentioned the circadian cycle, and I love that you called it circadian cycle, not the circadian rhythm. Yes, they're very similar and they're very much synonyms, but the idea here is it's a cyclic pattern that we need to be following. The cyclic pattern is very much push, go sympathetic, and then be able to come back to parasympathetic, right? You want to be able to engage in high performance, but then also engage in a powerful recovery process. You want to be able to run through these cyclic nature of life because, and we talk about this all the time on the podcast, but when the sun is up, that's performance time. And when the sun is down, that's recovery time. And that ideal practice of trying to align your internal biology and your physiology with the rhythms of the world, those cycles of the world, is a great tool and one that we haven't been paying enough attention to. Mm-hmm. So I think those are my two big takeaways so far. I'd love to ask you though, you mentioned the cannabinoid system, you mentioned the nutrient dense foods. What are some of the, and you've added a lot of the nice basics in. You mentioned the SPMs. Let's dig into those a little bit because the SPMs are a really unique thing, something I'm using with a lot of my clients now and seeing phenomenal results. What are SPMs, specialized pro-resolving mediators, and how do they function?
I can't believe you're letting me answer this question. This is so, but so SPM, I'll tell you where I came across it now. And JP, I was telling you before we started, I was listening to you on STEM Talk, Ken Ford's podcast, which for our listeners, besides the podcast you're on right now, this is another one you should add to your list because it's an outstanding podcast. But I heard someone on there talking about SPMs. They stand for specialized pro-resolving mediator. So if I say something here that's inappropriate, correct me. But when we have an assault to our system, whether it is to our whole system or to a cell, it triggers an inflammatory response almost 100% of the time. And so that inflammatory response starts with omega-6 fats. Omega-6 fats wind up coming down to arachidonic acid. Arachidonic acid enzymatically comes down to prostaglandins and other inflammatory states. And this is how we survive. It's critical. It's so important to have. It's why we're able to survive.
It's our threat response mode.
It's our threat response. Yeah. But the challenge is this, is that we don't tolerate pain well. And instead of dealing with pain, we go grab an ibuprofen or an aspirin, which interferes with the enzymes that make the arachidonic acid into the prostaglandins and the other inflammatory elements. Well, simultaneously, the omega-3 fats are being spun down to these specialized pro-resolving mediators. These are the chemicals that are responsible for clearing out the inflammation. And the number one driver of poor HRV is inflammation. Okay, number one. So
it's your immune system's response to threat. And the threat doesn't have to be physical. It could be emotional. It could be mental. It can just be any form
biochemical.
of threat.
Yep, exactly.
Any form of threat triggers the immune system.
My friend, again, I talk about Ron Garbo because he's brilliant. He says our system evolved to deal with tigers. And if a tiger walks through the door, our system is optimized for that. Our challenge is that we now have to deal with paper tigers. We have thousands and thousands of paper tigers. It's like living in the rattlesnake pit. It's the hypervigilance that gets you through it. And whether you get out of the rattlesnake, you can leave that trader job and go start a farm in Vermont and raise, pygmy goats. You're still going to have hypervigilance.
I say it doesn't matter whether you're being chased by a lion or by a boss or by an angry spouse. Any one of those things is going to trigger the same exact...
Or a letter from Revenue Canada or a letter from the IRS or whatever. Yeah, exactly. So to answer your question, Navaz, so specialized pro-resolving mediators are these cool little molecules. And again, I picked it up on STEM Talk. Well, they figured out how to spin these out of sardine oil in Portugal. My first direct experience with this was with my daughter. And she was playing lacrosse at Ohio State. She walked on there too. She had an experience much like ours. She wasn't good enough to be recruited as a scholarship athlete. They invited her to walk on. She's in her sophomore year and she's getting ready to be able to play in her first game. She's getting ready to sniff her first start, which is a game like on a Tuesday or a Wednesday. On the previous Thursday, she calls me just apoplectic. Just can't even talk. She's crying so hard. And I'm like, okay, we got to settle down. What's going on? She says, we were playing. I came down. I blew my ankle up. I'm done. I'm done for weeks. And I said, wait. I said, is it broken? No, it's not broken. They've x-rayed it. And I'm like, okay, that's a good sign. Now, I realize that we've changed our position on rice and ice. And I said, but I want that ankle in a 5-gallon bucket of ice water for 20 minutes every hour from now until for the next week, practically. Set an alarm on your phone and get up and do it at night. Number 2, there's going to be a bottle show up at your door tomorrow. I want you taking 4 grams of this a day, which is 4 pills. So the SPMs show up, ordered them on Amazon. They show up at her door. So that's a Thursday. By Saturday, she calls me. She says, I'm off my crutches. I'm walking. And the trainers are asking me what I'm doing. And I said, don't tell them. Tell them you're icing it aggressively, because they've never heard of this. I heard about it from the special operations community, that most athletic trainers don't sit around listening to podcasts like we do. And she played on a Tuesday with a first day diagnosis of being out for weeks, to where she played 4 or 5 days later. It was SPMs. And
this is something we could do an entire podcast on. And I think it's really, really important just to explain this a little bit, because we're diving in pretty deep, pretty fast. And this is new stuff, okay? But basically, when your immune system reacts to something, there's a cascade of different cytokines and cellular mobilizations that take place, and they move into the tissue, and you have swelling and redness and all the cardinal signs of inflammation that are going on. It's a very, very complicated process. And that process is initially designed to bring in all of this activity. But that activity is damaging. It's damaging the underlying tissue. It's sort of like you have to break a nose to fix it. Okay.
It's like the firefighters that come in to put out a fire, but they still create a ton of damage in doing so.
But what you need to do is, the moment that flame is put out, you need to get the construction crew or the repair crew back in there. Now, the repair crew is sort of at the peak of this cascade of damage that takes place. It's at the very end, and you have to resolve that inflammation, because you can't fix things with firefighters swinging axes.
Right.
So you have to resolve that inflammation. So the inflammation is really important. You have to go through that, but you want to get through it. And the moment you no longer need it, you need to resolve it and fix. But that's not what our bodies do, especially in modern society, when you don't have the right nutrients and you're not getting the right sleep and you're not doing all the right things. But what you do is, if you can promote that resolution of inflammation as rapidly as possible, you will heal faster. You will recover from an injury, and you'll be able to play. And we all know that when you sprain an ankle, the period of time where it hurts is very different from the period of time of its healing. Okay. It only hurts for, even if you don't do all the things you're talking about, it hurts for a week or two, but the real injury hasn't fully healed for about 8 weeks. So you're going to be weaker on that ankle.
And I think this is next generation kind of stuff that we see that frankly, the sporting community isn't talking about. It's in the operators community. It's not in the sporting community. It's just drips and drabs, but we can take this to a whole nother level in the fact that everybody has a bottle of ibuprofen in their cabinet. Okay. They get a little bit, they get hurt, they go load up. I do too. Don't get me wrong. I use it too, but I don't take an ibuprofen that I don't take an SPM. Okay. I take them together. And when you only take the ibuprofen, essentially what you're doing is you're preventing both the firefighters and the construction crew from getting into the cell. You're holding them both up, and you're just extending the entire process. So
yeah, I would argue don't even take the ibuprofen, because first off, we've talked about this before. You're absolutely nuking your microbiome. So don't do that. So if you're going to take an ibuprofen, which I don't suggest, if you do, you got to take a probiotic along with your SPM. But I would say let the inflammation happen, moderate it with ice and other things, but don't prevent it from happening. Just get through it as quickly as possible.
And I think, I think for an easy basic injury, for instance, I had my 7th and 8th knee surgery 5 years ago. My 7th was just to get loose bodies out of my knee. It should have been the easiest knee surgery I ever had in my life. I got a MRSA infection during that knee surgery. So 4 days after the knee surgery, they culture the MRSA. The next day, I'm back in the hospital. They flush the knee. I've got a PICC line in, and I am on IV antibiotics. So I was in bed for 2 months, IV antibiotics for 2 months, and I had a knee that was a mess. Okay. And literally the day before I had the surgery, gentlemen, I wrestled Olympic trials 11 days after a knee scope back in the early 80s. Okay. Not the best decision I ever made in my life, but it was my only shot ever at Olympic trials. So I was taking it. And I can handle pain. I can manage pain. This was a pain I've never experienced in my life. It was awful. And so it's been interesting working my way back using neural feedback, using HRV strategies. And I'll tell you the other thing that's interesting, that when we start to look at stem cell stimulation, I've had a lot of really good luck there in that process. But my point is that, JP, not everybody's as hard as you are can deal with the pain. Some people just, they need help. And I get
I've had kidney stones. I've had kidney stones.
Oh my God.
So
it's the worst. Yeah.
Everything else is just like a lollipop compared to that.
Yeah. That's the closest thing men experience to birth, right? With no oxytocin.
Oh, and I've spoken to women who have had both, and they've all said, I'd much rather go through birth than a kidney stone, because at least with a birth you're getting a child. Otherwise, you're just passing a stone.
You should be using nasal oxytocin the whole time just to get through it.
I know a guy who broke his femur in a car accident, and he's had a kidney stone. And I asked him, I said, which would you prefer? Break your femur again or have another kidney stone? He said, take the leg, man. Take the leg. So I don't know about that, but
so I don't want the audience to listen and say, oh, I'm throwing all my ibuprofen away, and I don't want to do that. I'm just saying, start to adjust, get that, understand, like JP said, I don't know that you're wrecking with an ibuprofen. I'm not sure you're wrecking your microbiome like you do when I was on 2 months of IV antibiotics. That pretty much flushed it. But you work that back. But again, going hand in hand with the SPMs with this, recognize that we work in cycles, whether it's a circadian rhythm or a female cycle or even sleep cycles at night, that hour and a half sleep cycle that we have at night. These are, and pay attention to it. I don't know about you guys, but when I have to set an alarm, I usually do not set an alarm most days. If I'm traveling or something, I have to get up early, I'll set an alarm. But I rarely am woken up by my alarm. I usually wake up, I see the time, and if I don't have an hour and a half left before the alarm, I just get up, because I know I'm out of that cycle and I'm never going to get it. So just sitting around waiting. So I get up and I start caffeinating right there. But this is the challenge as we work our way back through this. These are tools, and we integrated them into HRV Plus. And I think it's been I think chronic prophylactic consumption of SPMs is a good thing. You got to be careful. It can be pricey. You got to pay attention to what you're doing. I recognize that, but I think it's a good thing. But at the same time, what we're talking about is this interface between our neurological, our hormonal systems. And, I was listening to a guy the other day, and he used this acronym of ARC: awareness, relationships, and commitment. That when you're looking at things like HRV, it's just simply creating awareness. It's not a diagnosis, it's awareness, okay?
100% agree. I could not agree stronger with that statement.
So take the awareness and go to your relationships and say, okay, you know what? When I get my taxes done, I go to my accountant, and he will normally start this explanation of why he did this and why he did that. I don't effing care. Okay. That's why I paid you a couple $100 to do my taxes. Is this right? Am I going to get audited? Did I get the most money back? Great. Thanks. I'm moving on. And I think we can have the same effect on people when we're doing our deep dives. They're just like, wait a minute. If you're talking to your accountant doesn't give a hoot about many of these things. But so we have to have relationships that help us understand the impact enough to get activated. But then you commit. You take this information, the awareness and the relationships and the solutions, and then you commit to making a change. I love that acronym. I heard it a while back, and I've been using it a lot. Let the wearable tech, let these things be awareness tools. I know we describe it many times as the check engine light on our car. It's not the check engine light. It's the speedometer and the tachometer. It's awareness. Okay.
The full dashboard.
All the dials that we used to have that we don't have anymore. Oil pressure, where the fluid levels are, all that stuff. We don't have that anymore in cars. They've eliminated.
But take that, get awareness, get a relationship. That's why you do what you do. It's why I do what I do. I'm constantly working with people to help them understand, anywhere from freshman wrestlers all the way up to, I'm now old enough that I'm watching teammates pass away and things like that. And they're struggling with some real health issues. And, I went back to my 45th class reunion a couple weeks ago, and you know what? Homie's doing pretty good. I look pretty good compared to my classmates. And why is it? Well, I'm carrying a little extra lean mass back from that I work on maintaining. I'm not trying to grow it anymore, but I'm working on maintaining it, and more so than any of my classmates. And literally that could have been in the low inflammatory state that we really work hard to put, which, by the way, the vagal nerve stimulation has been a wonderful addition to both my and my wife's routine. I talked to, Navaz, you and I talked about this before. I was a little surprised when I got my vagal nerve stimulator that I didn't see a change in my HRV scores. And you explained it to me. It's like, it's not about, there's a wire, the wire gets frayed, you stimulate it, so all of a sudden the wire works better. So all of these senses, all of these signals travel better. My wife is doing wonderful on it. I mean, she looks like she's on Ozempic. It's crazy how well that's worked. So thank you.
No, that's JP.
Vagus nerve stimulation is a fantastic way to partner up or to take the information that you get from all the wearables and all the other things that you're doing to monitor what's happening in your system. This is, to me, this is the big problem. You put an Oura ring on, you're measuring your sleep scores, your heart rate variability, and other than telling you, okay, today's a day that I can go to the gym and work out really hard versus today's a day that I have to sort of go a little lighter. Other than that, not a lot of clear ways that you can fix those scores. Now you've just got something else to obsess about. What we tried to do is give people something that says, okay, now that you've monitored it, you obviously want to get better. You want to get higher HRV scores. You want to get better, longer time in deep sleep, et cetera. You want better sleep scores. Well, do something about it. Now, you can do deep breathing techniques. You can do meditation. But in your life, committing to doing those things takes time. And having a feeling that you have to commit more of your time to doing something for yourself means you're going to be more stressed because you don't have the time to do the other things that everybody else is commanding of you. Okay? So what I say is, let's shrink that down to 2 minutes. For 2 minutes in the morning, 2 minutes in the evening, and we're giving you, I say it as 2 hours of meditation in 2 minutes, which is you're getting that restoration of heart rate variability. You're getting the restoration of sleep. Now, if you're already doing all of those other things, for example, I run a lot. I make certain I'm sleeping properly. I'm on a very healthy diet. All of those things. So for me, it's going to be a very small amount of change that I'm going to get because I'm already doing all those things that other people don't have the time to commit to. But if I weren't in that state, for example, when I travel, or if I'm going to be in a situation where I can't work out, well, then that's a point where I'm like, okay, I need to supplement. I need to supplement with some vagus nerve stimulation because I don't have the time to do all the things that I need to do.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, my position on that has been when I travel, I may not need to work out because I'm already getting enough stress. Okay. I don't need to add in an additional level of stress, whether it be eustress or distress. And then so I actually take it down. We've already talked about the fact there's at least 4 rabbit holes we could go way down and spend hours in. But I think you're exactly right that this is the awareness. We're building awareness. You're developing relationships. Commit to doing that. And again, you're right. 2 minutes. I do 2 on each side. I do 2 minutes on the right, 2 minutes on the left. Sometimes I'll double that up. That's 5 minutes. That's 6 minutes. Okay. And then when I'm teaching box breathing, I'm like, give me 6 breaths. That's all I need. Just give me 6 breaths. I don't need you to do a Tibetan chant over a period of 5 hours to do this. I need 6 breaths. I need 5 minutes. If you have the awareness and we can tell the story, we can get the commitment and people can do better.
I think that's amazing. A great sentiment to kind of wrap a bow on this today on what a great conversation digging into how we can adjust and improve our performance and our capabilities and our recovery processes. And for those who are already using wearable devices, like I've got my Oura Ring for 7 years almost.
Mm-hmm.
It's an awareness tool. It is not a diagnostic tool. Everybody needs to know that. But it's a wonderful tool for those who have trouble figuring out what's truly going on in their body to become aware of what's going on. And that's where I think it's a beneficial tool. But it's a tool. It is not the answer to all of your problems. And use that tool in that particular way. HRV is a tool to be used, but not one to drive every decision that you're then going to make.
Exactly.
Inflammatory control is key overall for health span, for lifespan, for high performance. When you are performing, you're going into a sympathetic state generally, and you're driving a more inflammatory process. After that process is complete, your body requires recovery to take place. You're required to enter that cycle of going from sympathetic to parasympathetic, inflammatory to resolved inflammation. Tools like SPMs, tools like vagus nerve stim will help in that process of engaging that recovery system. Breathing, humming, chanting, gargling, singing, cold plunge, you name it. These are all meant to be tools that help in that resolution of inflammation and improving your capability of shifting between these two states. And that's what HRV is. HRV is the measure of your capability between shifting between sympathetic and parasympathetic state. How active is your cortisol sympathetic state, and how active are you able to then on demand and easily shift into parasympathetic state and enter that resolution state and control the inflammatory processes that are going on in your body. I think that's a great way to kind of wrap a bow on today. JP, any final thoughts?
Yeah, just 2 quick things. One, we didn't spend any time talking about mitochondria, and that's a whole separate bailiwick. But it's not separate. It's connected. And so when you downregulate inflammation, you're obviously making your mitochondria, giving your mitochondria a better environment to work in. As a final thing, I would just say, listen, there's no way the world is going to become less stressful. It's more important that you become more capable of handling that stress, and that you take the time out to resolve the effect that stress has on your body by doing things that are for you. So the 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 shouldn't necessarily be separated, in 30-year chunks. It's maybe 3-hour chunks. Spend 3 hours on yourself, spend 3 hours on your career, spend 3 hours on your family, that type of thing. We talk about it on many podcasts. We talk about the Galloway technique, which is, at the end of every hour, spend 5 minutes on doing something other than stressing. Talk to your spouse, talk to some friends, get a glass of water, do something.
Go for a walk.
And you only have to do it for a couple of minutes. You just have to break the cycle. Just break the cycle, and then you can go right back into it. So
the ultradian rhythm follows that exact pattern of 90 minutes of active, productive time and 20 minutes of down. Whatever that pattern is, figure out the pattern that's individually working. But I love that we've been able to come up with this. Don, where can people learn more about you and follow more of your work?
You can follow me. I'm on LinkedIn, Don Moxley on LinkedIn. That's the best place to communicate with me. I have a website that's called trainrecoverwin.com. I typically post a lot of information there, and you can also communicate with me through there. Those are the 2 places that's best to get a hold of me.
Wonderful. Don, this has been phenomenal, and we could, as we've mentioned, probably go on for another 5 hours. So this has been wonderful, but I want to be very cognizant of our time and our listeners' attention. So if you got to this point in the podcast, thank you so much for listening. I hope you got a lot out of this. You learned how you can utilize your HRV to support your high performance, and the lessons that Don has learned and shared with us are brilliant and wonderful. So thank you for doing that. If you got to this point in the podcast, share this episode with one person who you think could utilize this information to upgrade their health, and we'll catch you all on the next one.